Using role plays, simulations. Role plays are activities where the learners take on a role, meaning that they do not play themselves. They take on the identity of the role which has been allocated to them. Then the learner's behavior or their opinions or their use of language is not their own, but it is limited to the instruction card which has been handed over to them by the teacher. The language is also, which they have to use in this role, is pre-taught by them through a previous activity. A typical feature of the role play is information gap. In information gap, both the participants or none of the participants, they know some of the relevant information. The instruction card tells them some of the information, but they have to get the rest of the information from the other learner who is playing the role. So they discuss and they use the language to fill that information gap. And in the process, they negotiate meaning. However, the disadvantage is that since there hasn't been enough time for the learners to remember that language, to learn that language which has been given to them in the instruction card, then they would have to look at the instruction card during the role play. This screenshot here tells about a typical information gap activity in which there are two participants, A and B, and they are handed over their instruction cards, and each of them has a certain amount of activity which the other one doesn't have. So they talk to each other and they try to get information from the other person. So they're playing the role of two executives who are meeting each other after 2 years' time. They had previously met at a conference, and now they are trying to catch up on that previous meeting and trying to get information from each other. Simulations are quite different from a role play. A simulation refers to an activity where the learner is playing himself or herself, and he ideally simulates what he or she might do in real life. So whereas in role play, you act the role of another person, in simulation, you keep your own identity and try to simulate what you would actually do in your real life. So, for example, a student would act as a student and a teacher would act as a teacher. The aim is to create a particular kind of situation in the safety of the classroom. So a scenario is built up and the learners are given a topic which they have to about which they have to talk or get information from, but they would remain in their own roles. The purpose is that when the learner meets a similar situation in real life, he or she would feel confident because in that simulation activity, they have gone through the same thing, the same situation. So they would say, I have been through this before, and they would feel confident. Sometimes it is difficult to create such a situation in which all the players are playing themselves. For example, if they're playing at a buyer-seller negotiation, and if both the players they come from the purchase department, then one of them would have to be, only one of them can be the buyer. The other one has to fulfill the role of the selling one. However, they also have their this type of activity also has its advantage. The main purpose is that there has to be a realistic reason for carrying out this simulation. For the activity to be in English, the learners would otherwise be using their own language, at least in a monolingual group. The main aim is to create a situation in which there is suspension of disbelief. The learners should be distracted by the fact that the activity is being carried out in the classroom and it is not real. Indeed, the success of any simulation is that the students keep on discussing about it even when the activity has finished and they are out of the class. Learners become so fully involved that they are not even distracted by this fact that it is actually they are in the classroom, and they keep discussing it outside the class. This type of simulation activity is useful for in-company groups where people have to have real jobs on which they have to focus on, and they need practice for various activities which are carried out in that environment. It basically removes their fear of making mistakes because it is not the real environment, it is that safe environment of the class. Sometimes the teacher involves a good speaker of English into this activity. So the speaker can take the role of a teacher, and the student can be himself and keep talking about the issues which he is concerned with in real life. The learner can also talk to the teacher. The teacher can be in the role of the boss, and the student can talk about real problems which he faces at the workplace. Another approach is to involve good English speakers who take part in simulations. The visitors might play the part of a customer or a partner, or simply to discuss the work-related issues with the teacher. So an example of simulation activity would have to be what would happen before the day of, what type of preparation would be there before the simulation is being carried out. So what learners have to discuss, what is the aim of the activity, what are the activities carried out for business communication purposes or for language learning purposes, is there a logical sequence to the planned activities. All of these questions need to be done before the day when the simulation has to be carried out. And on the day of when the simulation has to be carried out, you have to make sure that everyone fully understands the situation and give people enough time to prepare themselves, make sure they understand the rationale behind the activity, consider using observer to assist with the feedback, and make sure the feedback includes the business task as well as language related issues. Most groups will be more than willing to give the teacher the type of feedback which he wants, and this could be very beneficial because it would lead to possible improvements. The last stage of the simulation is that learners redesign it with the teacher.